So, final thread before we close this part of the show. I want you to touch on, what happened from, FDR to Clinton.
Yeah.
I think Obama is a much more defensible figure, but there still is the neoliberal turn, obviously.
Yes, decidedly.
And then I want you to introduce Bernie Sanders and Eugene Debs into the mix. But we'll get to that sec. Yeah, you can handle all this. You keep talking. That's all you got.
No,
this.
I can handle it, but I don't know what time.
You're doing great. We got some time.
Good. Okay. So Roosevelt, they didn't use the term. He redefined liberalism in America, which was our rendition of social democracy.
Right.
Okay, and in many ways, I'll make this case. There's a piece I did for Bill Moyers on the Moyers and Company website. Social democracy is not only 100% American. We were the pioneering social democratic nation state, which we can talk about if you want. But anyhow, but Roosevelt dies, April 1945. Truman becomes president. Truman's first initiatives were to actually pursue what was known as the Economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt had offered in his State of the Union address of 1944 to put more meat, you might say, on the four freedoms. Okay, and he pushed for national health care. Truman Truman was. I've always had reservations about Truman, Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to domestic policy, he actually had. He is the one who really put.
Well, he sort of set the Johnson tempo.
Yes,
great domestic achievements and horror abroad.
Yeah, I guess you might put it that way. Absolutely.
That's how
And moreover, he's the one who launches the civil rights agenda out of the White House.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So anyhow, the problem is the Republicans had won control of the House and the Senate, where they could win enough with Southern votes if they needed it to make things happen.
Right.
Now, my view as a labor person is that the demise of the real Democratic Party is the failure of the Democratic Party to defend labor. So we had Taft-Hartley in 1947, okay? Mm-hmm. Then you've got Adlai Stevenson running for president in 52 and 56. Talk about pseudo-liberals.
Right.
Okay? Pseudo-liberals.
This is a kind of precursor of the neoliberal egghead.
Yeah. And he didn't even read, apparently. The egghead, so-called intellectual, was not known for being a reader.
Wow. Okay.
Why Eleanor Roosevelt was so willing to endorse him, I have no idea, other than who else would she find, perhaps. 1960, Kennedy was not a liberal.
Right.
Okay. He would actually
Cold War.
He told people
center-right Democrat.
He came back from World War II and ran for Congress, and he refused to join the American Veterans Committee, which was the most progressive veterans group of its day. And in fact,
and he refused to condemn McCarthy as well.
His family was intimately connected to McCarthy,
and he specifically didn't. Right, and he didn't vote to censure him on the Senate floor. Right. And Bobby Kennedy.
Well, he said, he was out ill health. Right. I think it was.
I had better things to do.
Yes. So anyhow, he has to be pushed in a liberal direction, and it was only so far that he would go anyhow.
Right.
On every one of those. The surprise candidate, you might say, the surprise president, and to this day, probably the most surprising figure in American history in some ways, is Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
It's the tragedy of Johnson. We know what that is. But the other tragedy, less attended to, is that Johnson was able to enact civil rights and voting rights, not only, but essentially because of the civil rights struggle, but the folks who lobbied to make possible civil rights, who made the Great Society War on Poverty first initiatives possible, was the labor movement.
Right.
And he said to them, here's the list. We do this first, and somewhere down the line was undo Taft-Hartley. And when they got to that moment in late 65, must have been the first filibuster he failed to break.
Jeez.
Now, I'll also tell you a footnote to that is that George McGovern, who had been a labor historian and now is senator from South Dakota.
Was it North or South?
I always go through that, and I think it's South Dakota.
South Dakota.
I was right. He was
South
wrong,
Dakota.
Right?
I was just guessing.
I was just kidding. I'm
wrong.
Okay.
I like that. That was good.
Okay. So here's the thing.
Yeah.
He votes no to break to end the.
Well, labor's always been a big mark.
So the Democrats
legacy.
are literally turning their backs on labor, and then McGovern led the commission that reduced the influence of labor in the Democratic Party.
Right.
And then Gary Hart, he ran a campaign for the Senate in Colorado, which was literally an attack on the New Deal tradition.
Right.
And then Jimmy Carter comes from a family out of Georgia that hated Roosevelt.
Right.
So it's the Democratic Party is constantly moving, already drifting in that direction to break with the Roosevelt tradition and turned its back on labor. Look, 1968 in this country is 1978 is where Carter abandons the effort to reform labor, abandons the consumer rights movement. I mean, it's
Right.
Whew.
So then and then specifically, so okay, and then under, and I guess we could just say in different ways, Clinton and Obama obviously fall in the
No, Bill Clinton. I mean, if we reviewed the sins of Bill Clinton as president, Monica Lewinsky aside, I mean the political sins.
Oh, I thought that was the cool part.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just
Okay.
joking. No, I didn't think that was cool.
Oh, by the way, did you know that this guy who's been nominated to the Supreme Court was
Yeah.
on Ken Starr? Did you already talk about that?
I mentioned it. He was
Yeah.
a Ken Starr. I believe he also, and in
And
New
he
York
was the
Times,
one-
apparently they suggested that
He-
because he
yeah.
signed off on that Vince Foster wasn't murdered, that was a sign of moderation. It's just like, yeah, the guy offed himself. I
Yeah,
guess
but
I'm
meanwhile,
moderate.
by most accounts,
Yeah.
he's the one who came up with the most lascivious questions to ask Clinton in the Lewinsky investigation.
Of course.
Okay,
Yeah, well.
and we could go on. But anyhow, to go back. So
Sweet.
But,
I want to
but
get
more
this clear.
importantly,
Yes.
it's mass incarceration. You know where I'm going.
Yeah, but
the
Bill
end of
Clinton-
the end of the Glass-Steagall Act, which then enables
Financial
banks to go-
deregulation,
financial
mass
deregulation,
incarceration.
right? Ends the welfare as we know it, right? Et
Right.
cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
Right.
I see a direct line between Clinton and the 2007, 8, 9 debacle.
Definitely.
Which can I then add one last thing? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
People
one-
always say to me, "What happened in Wisconsin in 2016?" And I said, "Hey, Bernie won the primary. People, why do we assume that working people don't have memories? Why would they? How could they not forget what the Clinton administrations
Right.
did? Okay,
Right.
That's all.
Where does is Bernie Sanders the child of Eugene Debs or FDR or both?
Okay, I voted for Bernie.
Yes.
I believed in his candidacy. I have some reservations now. I will tell you that. Okay.
My board, Matt. And you just said you have some reservations now, and
I
I'm
do.
going to respond like this. Oh, no, you can't hear. You got to put on your headphones for the full
Oh.
comedic effect, Professor Kaye. All right. You have reservations?
Yes.
Okay, well, first, before you get to the reservations,
Yes, but-
maybe it is your reservations. I would like to, what political tradition do you think he fits in?
Well, I think he does. I think
Yeah.
he fits in the FDR. He fits in the FDR tradition.
Okay.
Okay, and I love the fact that he idolizes Debs.
Yes.
Debs, one of the greatest Americans ever.
Right.
Okay, one
Right.
of my heroes.
Right.
But here's the thing: Debs and Roosevelt both had an understanding of America, a radical understanding of America. Roosevelt did too, in fact. And that radical understanding was to appreciate the struggles that went into the making of what we have achieved. Now, here's the problem with Bernie. You will recall that he talked about being a democratic socialist, and in November of 2015, went to Georgetown University to deliver a speech to explain democratic socialism
Right.
to America.
Right.
And at that point, he recalled FDR's speech, the Economic Bill of Rights speech, referred to Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King.
Yep.
And then what did he do? We got back on the trail, and he kept talking about Scandinavia. Now, I got nothing against Scandinavia, and I think they are remarkable. I think social democracy in Scandinavia is something to be admired. But why the hell didn't he go back on the campaign trail and talk about the American radical, progressive, and social democratic traditions?
Right.
And
Right.
and he set himself up so that Hillary in the debate said, "Oh, here, Denmark again."
Right.
Right? I mean, I think he lost it. I'm not telling you he would have won the nomination and then the presidency necessarily, but I can tell you this: I am really fucking tired of Democrats who do not embrace the American radical tradition, because we're not going to cultivate an American progressive story today if we don't lay claim to the American progressive story of the past. And I can't tell you how often you start listening to these politicians. Look, I think the state we're in right now was predictable with the Republicans. It was unpredictable 40 years ago when the class war really heated up and the Democrats didn't engage it.
Right. That's interesting. It's funny. It's interesting you say that because I think on one hand, I mean, obviously the ethos of this show is extremely borderless, and I'm very much I want people, and in the illicit histories, I mean, I want people to know about Kenyan or Tanzanian socialism, Michael Manley. I certainly want to, global dynamics. I wondered at times, actually, if Bernie Sanders, particularly in the context of the modern Democratic Party, in the positive sense, in terms of a multi-identity coalition, I actually was like, maybe you should also talk about, a little bit more Michael Manley or Salvador Allende, like a little bit more people that also represent other parts of the globe other than places that look like Vermont. But paradoxically, conversely, no, I think you're right. I actually think that there's nothing wrong with laying claim to who you are, where you are, your basic geography and your identity. You're running to lead a country, and you're claiming a certain tradition. So you might as well make the case that you flow from a tradition that wins here. Sounds right to me.
Look, in 1931,
yeah,
Roosevelt said to a friend, the Republicans don't seem to want to have anything to do with Abraham Lincoln. Let's make him one of our own too. Right? I mean, Roosevelt had this sense of what Americans would respond to.
Right. That's really smart. Right. So
he quoted
you want me to read
Thomas
Paine, you prick?
No, really.
Oh, here's Professor Kaye again with the 4 freedoms. Whatever. You know what? I like Sweden. Fuck
Hillary Clinton launched her campaign in 2015 at 4 Freedoms Park here in New York City.
Right.
By the way, I was the advisor to 4 Freedoms Park.
Right.
The historical advisor.
Right.
So here's the thing. But if you if you listened and then went back and read the speech, you'd find she never actually mentioned what the 4 freedoms were.
Yep.
And never mentioned the 4 freedoms again after that.
Right.
I mean, the Democratic political leadership runs from the American past. It doesn't just not know it. It literally, if it does at all, runs from it. And I even wonder if they run from it because they're afraid of political correctness. Because we on the left have spent too many years in a one-dimensional critique of America and not picked up on the radical tradition.
Right.
That's my sense.
Right. And again, there's no contradiction. It's a both. I mean, I've had this conversation a lot with regards to foreign policy issues. I'm very much, and I think our primary focus as Americans should be opposing U.S. imperialism, because this is where we live. But you can't understand, Syria as an example, without understanding every player there. And when you understand every player there, you realize it's a multi-imperial game. And so I think there's, especially in the political realm, where you have to just sort of, you can't obscure history, but you also have to just pick and choose what you're going to run with and how you frame
you
your
brought up
case.
Debs, as long as we're talking Bernie Sanders.
Talk about Debs for a second, and then we're going to go to the post game.
Okay, so Debs is defending himself from charges of the sedition charges in the courthouse, right?
Right. And
what does he do? He stands there defending himself.
He goes, in Denmark I could say this. That's what Eugene Debs did. I think Sweden does have a good system. Yes.
We're talking Debs here.
Okay. No. Well, no.
Okay.
Eugene Debs was Bernie Sanders.
He brings into the courtroom to stand alongside of him Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln. He brings in the greats of the radical and progressive tradition in America.
Right.
In defense, and by the way, he brings Lincoln in to remind everyone that Lincoln opposed the war with Mexico.
Right.
He brings Paine in to remind everyone of the revolution that, had it not been for Paine, might not have happened. That America can only be America when Americans indeed remember who they are.
Harvey, JK, are you going to hang out with us for some of the post game?
I hope so.
Okay.